Good morning, and thank you for joining the WEIM Governance Review Committee Stakeholder Meeting. Please note that all the audio connections will be muted until the Q&A portion of the call. With that, I'll turn the call over to Burton Gross, Deputy General Counsel. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Just a quick sound check. Can you hear me, operator?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome to the GRC General Session. I'm going to start off with a couple of procedural matters, and then I will turn the meeting over to our chair of the GRC, Therese Hampton, for the substance of the meeting. The first procedural item is to do the roll call. So I'll do that, calling first the voting members and then at the end the non-voting members, just to check that they're on the line. Michelle Beck?
Here.
Tony Braun?
Here.
Suzanne Cooper?
Here.
Eric Eisenman?
Here.
Therese Hampton?
Here.
Jeff Nelson?
Here.
Amanda Ormond?
Here.
Pam Sporborg?
Here.
Letha Tawney?
Here.
Rob Taylor?
Here.
Rebecca Wagner?
Here.
Cameron Yurkowski?
I'm here.
Angelina Galitova?
Here.
And John Prescott?
Here.
Great. All right. Next, as we typically do, before we move on to the substance of the meeting, we have two more items. The next item is if there are any individuals at the meeting who want to make any comments on matters that are not part of the public agenda, this is an opportunity to do so. So if the operator could just wait a moment to see if there's anybody who has any comments, public comments they would like to make that are not part of the agenda.
To make a public comment, if you are using the computer audio, feel free to place yourself in the question queue by utilizing the raise hand feature located at the bottom of your screen. Move your cursor to make the toolbar appear if needed. I can hear someone unmuted on their line. Please make sure you're muted so that there is no background noise. If you're on a mobile device, tap your screen to display the toolbar and then press raise hand. You will be unmuted when it's your turn. A pop-up message will appear and you'll need to accept the unmute message to become unmuted. If you're on the phone only, please press #2 to enter the comment queue. And just a reminder for the panelists, I'll be advancing the slides. So whenever you want me to advance them, please say next slide. I do not see anyone in the verbal queue as of now.
Okay, thank you. All right, and now the last procedural item is the approval of the general session minutes for the July 20th, 2022 GRC General Session meeting. For that, I need a motion from one of the voting members of the GRC.
This is Michelle. I'll make the motion.
Thank you. And a second?
This is Therese. I'll second.
Thank you, Therese. And I'll now just go through the voting members for their votes. And if you were a member or were not in attendance at the meeting, feel free to abstain if that's your preference, of course. Michelle Beck.
Aye.
Tony Braun.
Aye.
Suzanne Cooper.
Abstain.
Okay. Eric Eisenman.
Aye.
Therese Hampton.
Aye.
Jeff Nelson.
Abstained. Wasn't present.
Okay. Amanda Ormond,
Aye.
Pam Sporborg,
Aye.
Lisa Tani,
Aye.
Lisa, okay. Rob Taylor,
Aye.
Rebecca Wagner,
Aye.
Cameron Yurkowski.
Aye.
Okay, well, the minutes are approved then, and I will turn it over to Chair Hampton for the substance of the meeting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bert. Thanks everyone for being here, for staying on a Monday morning to talk about governance. We really appreciate it. I'm going to do a really quick intro of our purpose today. As you know, we issued a straw proposal in July. We took comments through August 15th. We received a larger number of comments than we've ever received before, which is terrific. They're very, very helpful to us. And this is an opportunity to just have discussion about them. We have 4 main questions. A GRC member is going to moderate one of each of the questions. We've got panelists, people that have volunteered to speak on those. We will hear from them. Then we will let the GRC members ask clarifying questions of them. And then we'll open it up to everyone to either ask clarifying questions of the panelists or offer their own comments. So comments that maybe they had made, and really the goal here is to give context to your comments and have a dialogue among stakeholders to better understand the issues. All of this is super important for us and helpful in terms of making some decisions about a revised straw proposal. What you can see on the screen right now is the list of GRC members. We have everybody on the line today, so we're happy to hear from you. We will note Jeff Nelson is a new Governance Review Committee member. He is replacing the spot that was previously held by Andy Campbell, who is now an EIM governing body member. And so if we go to the next slide, this is the first question. I'm going to hand this over to Commissioner Lisa Tani to moderate this question.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Therese. So we received a wide range of comments. The discussion in the comments about the type of authority, primary or joint, reflected the dialogue we had in our own sessions, and I think reflected the trade-offs and challenges that we articulated in the straw proposal. But there seemed to be a growing consensus in that space. And so today we wanted to dive into the scope more, although if anyone wants to bring up questions around the commenters want to raise issues around the type, they'd be most welcome to. But in the comments, there was a lot of nuance around the scope of authority, a lot of different ideas and issues raised. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from the commenters, sort of unpacking those nuances for us so that we can better understand where different commenters are coming from around those issues. So the question that the presenters have been posed with is, from your perspective, what are the most important issues around the delegation of authority that you want us to consider as we think through all of the comments and options that we've received? And I'd love to start this morning with Mary Winke, if you'd like to come on screen and share your thoughts with us. And then we'll go to Josh Walter, just so we don't, just so you know who's next up, and I'm not surprising you. Mary.
All right. Thanks, Lisa. Can you hear me okay? Great. All right. So obviously a really key issue here with respect to issues around the delegation of authority. And really, I think how PGP is looking at this is through the lens of how do you get to the best decision-making framework. And in light of the environment we're in, or the current construct where we don't have a legislative change, where we can create a truly independent governance structure. So I think in the construct that we're operating under, we think that the joint authority model really gets to that objective in terms of getting to a better decision-making model. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I think we think that working the two bodies working together, they can understand each other's perspectives better by discussing it in an open forum. They will increase situational awareness of both bodies by having them work together on issues. And really that it reflects, again, the fact that the Board of Governors cannot completely delegate its authority to the EIM governing body. So we have this approach that really is trying to get to better decision-making within the existing construct. So, you know, PGP is supportive of the joint authority model and encourage that many stakeholders also support that model. And then the other thing that I really wanted to talk a little bit about today is the scope of the delegation of authority. And I think from PGP's perspective, you can't kind of separate out the type of joint authority from the scope of the joint authority. And I think one of the trade-offs with respect to going with a joint authority model is then that you would expand the scope or consider as broad of a scope as possible for that joint authority in recognition that, you know, both bodies are, you know, directed to include the interests of all stakeholders in their decision making. So we see the risk of over-inclusion as much less than the risk of under-inclusion in terms of that scope of joint authority. So we strongly encourage an approach to the scope of delegation of authority that starts out as expansive as possible, recognizing then an exception process where certain rules or certain types of rules would be excluded from that joint authority. So our proposal is to start with joint authority covering all day-ahead and real-time market rules and establish an exception, a set of exceptions or an exception process. And I think this is actually something that was in, I think, Bank's comments. I don't want to attribute something to Tony that I don't remember, but I think that I think Bank and SMUD were proposing an exception process. So I think you could establish a set of exceptions and then also an exception process where individual rules could be assessed on kind of a case-by-case basis to evaluate whether or not it's appropriate for an exception. The other thing that PGP raised in its comments that I'm interested in a discussion about, if there's time, is moving away from the sort of impact test approach. And I think we really recognize that assessing impact, assessing materiality is something that is pretty difficult, and particularly on kind of a bright line basis. And our assessment is that the applied to test is a little clunky in that regard. I think there's lots of examples where a rule applies to either the Kaiso BAA or EDAM entities and not the other, and yet there will be a very significant impact to whoever the rule does not apply to. So we think that it is kind of a problematic approach to use that apply to test, and that there may be a different option to explore that's really looking at kind of the type of rules that are under joint authority for the Kaiso BAA and for EDAM entities. So that instead of, we're sort of looking at it from a jurisdictional sense and sort of what types of rules does joint authority have jurisdiction over, and ensure that sort of jurisdictional scope is equal or comparable as, you know, to the Kaiso BAA and to the EDAM entities. So I think we just kind of proposed it as something that we'd like the GRC to consider. We didn't do a comprehensive review of the Kaiso tariff to sort of figure out how implementable it is. So recognize that there may be some challenges there, but just wanted to kind of propose a different approach of getting away from just looking at impact and sort of looking at it more from a, you know, what is really the jurisdiction of the different bodies, and that that jurisdictional question can maybe be a better way to establish an exception process to take rules out of joint authority and have them just be under the Board of Governors. So I will stop there. Happy to answer more questions on that. I don't know, Lisa, if you want me to just go to Josh or if you want to say anything in between there.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mary. We'll go straight to Josh and we'll go through all the panelists, and then unless a GRC member wants to raise their hand and interject, I'll just keep working through the panelists. But thank you, Mary. Josh.
Good morning. Thank you, Letha. Yeah, so Seattle is supportive of the work that the GRC's done thus far, and in particular, the thoughtful and I would say very in-depth consideration of the joint authority versus primary authority issue. I think it's been well vetted. I think the GRC's work is landing on, if not optimal, a high level of adequate solution as it relates to that particular issue of joint versus primary. So I do applaud the GRC and the work that's been done in their consideration. CLC Light supports the joint authority model and believes that it's appropriately requires collaboration, and I do think that element of collaboration is the key element, right? It's the idea that your deliberative processes start to trigger practice and muscle memory of how we can all kind of continue to work together in the optimal solutions for the market. So I think that in moving forward with the joint authority, it really is an element of collaboration, deliberation, in practicing and understanding and knowing where each individual or regional positions are and how the market affects different entities, different market participants, different regions. And again, getting that understanding and practicing is key to an effective joint authority model. So I think we're moving in the right direction on there. I do agree that where things stand today in the process the GRC is undertaking is this issue of the scope of authority, and in particular the applies to test. I completely agree with Mary that as it applies or as stated thus far, the applies to test is a bit clunky. I do very much like the idea of starting with the assumption that more is better than less, starting off with joint authority applying to all elements of the market for EDAM and EIM with a inclusion or exclusion process is somewhere to something to look into, most definitely. So I encourage the GRC to look into that type of issue or process moving forward. I think that when it comes to how the applies to test will work, I think that, sorry, buddy, hold on a second. Excuse me. The idea that, we have to understand that there's layers to the way that, that issues are applying to different market participants. And those layers may not have an immediate effect, but that downstream effect does have significant impact on other market participants. So again, the process in which issues and items are included, I think ultimately should be starting at a level of assuming everything's in. and then working through process of exclusion. I think that will ultimately get to a helpful place in assuring that we do have an adequate level of deliberation from the highest level of decision making at the market. And I don't really have much else to add that other than what Mary's stated, what I've already stated today. So I'm happy to turn it over to the next, who I'm not entirely sure who that is.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
I think let's move to Scott Renzel. I'd love to hear the perspectives or comments from the entities in California. Had a little different nuance to them, so interested to hear some of the entities from California.
Sure. Scott Renzel. I am with Pacific Gas and Electric Company. Thank you all for the opportunity to talk today. Like the other panelists have expressed thus far today, PG&E is supportive of the progress made thus far in the GRC straw proposal for the extended day-ahead market governance answer. PG&E is really focused in on creating a fair, transparent, equitable, and applicable appropriate market involvement answer. And I think the GRC has done a good job of striking that balance in what is proposed in joint authority. It was a positive move forward. It has largely been seen as a positive move forward in the EIM space. And I believe that expanding it into EDAM will have the same kind of impact as we move forward. I think it creates a clear line of sight to market involvement. I understand that it is not perfect, and that there are, continue to be and will continue to be outstanding questions about how the market works. My concern around the exception process is the market is constantly evolving, and you may find yourself in a position where the exception list becomes long. For example, there are things that are considered part of the day-ahead market today that are not being contemplated as part of EDAM, at least at the start. Convergence bidding, intertie bidding are a couple of elements that are not included. They do not apply. They may in the future, and the apply to test has a continuous process to reevaluate, reassess, and incorporate when and where appropriate as the market design evolves. Those that exist in the ISO know that, and those that exist and have followed the ISO know that market seems to never stop, to be quite honest with you, and I don't expect it to. So the level of performance that I think is achieved with the apply to test and the continuous reevaluation of that once you establish appropriate governance over those items feels like a very good starting point to launch off for EDAM. And I think it's a positive step forward in allowing for appropriate voices throughout that marketplace to be heard, listened to, and evaluated as that market expands. Let me stop there for either questions or happy to move forward.
Thank you.
Participant. Absolutely.
Yes, I think we'll bring Kathleen in, and then I think we have time, so Chair LeVar, I think we'll also bring you in after Kathleen. Kathleen, please go ahead.
Great, thank you. Letha, can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, I'll just start with saying thank you so much to the GRC for inviting me and Vistra to be on this panel. It's definitely an honor. I think this is very difficult content, and we really appreciate the way that the GRC is approaching it. You seem to be approaching this process with very open minds and probing questions, and I think that it's been, a great example of a job well done. I'm also pretty optimistic, even from hearing the panelists so far, that there does, like Letha was summarizing, it seems to be some kind of gelling of concepts and moving towards one direction. I'm not going to belabor we support joint authority because I think that that's been said by others, but I will go to a level of detail that I don't believe we've gone to yet I'm a fairly detail-oriented person, and that can be in this context, I will provide the additional context for what we said. We provided pretty crisp comments that said that we support having a joint authority, even under EDAM, that would include exceptions or exclusions for topics. High level, that's because we think it's difficult to brainstorm an inclusive list that does not exclude things that could be of importance to the EDAM entities. So we think that there's greater risk if we try and approach it from creating a list of what's inclusive versus creating some exceptions. We do think it's more feasible. And with that, my detail-oriented comment is, and for those who don't know, I have participated in the stakeholder process for a very long time. And so I agree with what Scott said about the exceptions list could be fairly long, but I think once the framework is set up, it should be fairly seamless to implement an approach that we're kind of thinking of. I think that instead of there being a single test, we could approach it from an intuitive perspective of there's content that clearly applies to the broader EDAM footprint, EIM footprint. That should be any kind of proposal or content, whether it's at the tariff level, the BPM level, or an operating procedure level that applies to EDAM entities should be within joint authority scope. And I think that's fairly non-controversial because that's where we are today. With the difference of under EDAM, this expands to day-ahead operations and day-ahead issues rather than just real time. The second piece is that I think what has been debated is what does apply to mean? And so in the actual practice of implementing the apply to test, it's easy to debate. Does apply to mean it's a rule that literally has to be like something that an EIM entity has to do versus impact? Because I know Mary mentioned impact, but I would say impact is some people's opinion is that impact is not under applied to today. We have taken the position that impact should be under applied to, even under existing applied to concepts, but it is a debated option. So I think clarity on that is really important because when it comes down to the stakeholder process, there are suggestions put forward, stakeholders can comment on them. I have provided that kind of feedback multiple times that I think items that impact EIM entities or EIM participants should be under joint authority. But if others take a position that that's not a part of the tariff that applies to it, it only impacts, then we're at a bit of an impasse because we're different minds, bright minds can have different opinions about the same kind of jurisdictional question. If the second pass of the test that we would imagine is that in order to implement an impact test in addition to an applied to test, I agree with Josh. We should start broadly and assume that everything is under joint authority. This next step could be just to carve out sections of the tariff sections that clearly aren't within authority. And I think that's to Scott's point that this can get fairly long, but I think once you have a list of the tariff sections that are clearly not within joint authority, it's fairly easy for a staff level individual to implement this process. And I'll just give a couple examples. Section 40, which is the implementation of the California RA program, clearly carved out. Section 41, reliability must run unit, carved out. It could be very easy just to list the tariff sections and to list whether or not as a default it's considered joint authority or not. And that could be the starting place for a discussion point in the stakeholder process. And I want to reiterate, I think that discussion is really important. So when it's put forward what the authority is, another area that the stakeholder process would benefit from is not just suggesting authority, but also discussing it and creating a more robust collaboration on some of these more gray area topics. So I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. Chair LeVar for the BOSSer.
Thank you. Just to introduce myself, my name is Thad LeVar. I'm with the Utah Public Service Commission and here today representing the body of state regulators. And, that's an interesting group. Whenever we submit comments, our goal is to find consensus, and we have members from a lot of states with a lot of different policy perspectives on how this Western energy imbalance market functions and the benefits we receive from it. And I think that's one of the success stories is you have people, stakeholders with different objectives who are all finding success and finding value and benefits from this program. Our comments with respect to delegation of authority and scope of authority, I think, center around a couple of principles. We were asked before this to focus on not so much summarizing what we said in our comments, but what was the reason for them. And I think two or three objectives behind the body of state regulators' comments were a desire for transparency and durability in the governance structure, and an ability to allow future discussions to focus on substantive material issues rather than procedural issues. And so our support of the joint authority model and the scope with continuing the applies to test goes to those things. And I think our perspective is it allows the successes to keep moving forward. Everyone has a shared goal of elevating the independence of the governing body. And of course, there are limits under the current statutory structure, but that's the goal, and that's what we're moving towards. And we also, as a body of state regulators, wanted to recognize the improvements that already have been made. And there were significant governance changes that went into effect at the beginning of this year. And we wanted to respect those and give those time to develop. For example, the issue of what would be primary and what would be advisory authority for the governing body, I think the bosser felt like that just needs more time under the existing structure, under the existing mechanisms without wholesale changes to things. So that's the basis for our comments. Again, I won't repeat what we said, but I think those were the underlying policies behind them, and I'm happy to answer any questions on this or other issues later today. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thank you all. Let me pose a question to you, and colleagues from the GRC would love to see some raised hands if you have questions for the panelists. But to any of the panelists who'd like to respond, I'm curious, as you think about the scope and the nuanced different perspectives you brought up about scope, how do you think about the advisory authority function? Does it can it be utilized in a way that helps alleviate some of your worries about what might be excluded versus included, or is it not meaningful enough? I'd love some perspectives about that, and then I'll look for raised hands from my colleagues. Just jump in. Go ahead, Mary.
Oh, thanks, Lisa. I think what I would articulate on that is that I think the advisory authority is something that is important and critical, but I also think there's something important and critical about having a vote and being in the room on a level basis with the other people who are also in decision-making authority. So I guess under the sort of framework that PGP proposed, that is sort of around this concept of jurisdiction versus as much focus on impact, you might have advisory authority for a situation where there's a rule that's been excluded for jurisdictional reasons but still has impact. But I think having kind of a framework that does not rely on that advisory authority for kind of a backstop or replacement for really carefully ensuring that the jurisdiction of both bodies is covered and that they have a vote with respect to the issues over which they have jurisdiction.
Thank you. Kathleen?
Yeah, thank you. I will say that Visitor's perspective is that there's not, and I say this with all due respect, there's not a great deal of difference between no authority and advisory authority. And so our position would be that all items are advisory. And so even I gave the example of Section 40, which is California's RA program. Well, entities that are in other portions of the West are now getting very active in RA program development themselves and may have some really good advisory opinions and advisory suggestions to provide on that tariff section. That I would think that would be absolutely within the scope of advisory authority on sections that are not under joint authority. I wouldn't want to get into a space of saying there is no authority to have any position or opinion or suggestion. There's advisory where you can have advice to share with the Board of Governors, and then there's joint authority. In our minds, it's simpler and more intuitive to think of it as joint authority and advisory authority on everything else. Just a couple thoughts.
Thank you. Thad.
Thanks. Just a couple of brief thoughts. I think the conversation about authority and how impactful advisory authority is underlined by the voluntary nature of this market. That's one of the unique and successful things about this market, and will continue to be under a day ahead proposal, is that it's a voluntary market, and that is meaningful on what significance advisory authority has. And the other thing that I think is meaningful on this is the proposed bylaw changes that the GRC is suggesting, requiring that broader scope for both bodies, and it is an issue that I think is worth some time to give the Board of Governors and WEIM governing body the opportunity to apply those bylaws. As a state regulator, when I work in my day job, the statutes that we operate under are always our starting and ending point. And I hope that the bylaws are the same, although there are also, statutory structures within California that govern here also. But I would hope that this proposed bylaw change, if it goes through, meaningfully informs how the two entities approach both joint authority and advisory authority. Thanks.
Thank you. And Josh.
Thanks. Yeah, I think all of our comments ultimately underline the importance of the question, right? The idea that what I think many of us are ultimately looking for is a level of parity in decision making. And by continuing to have some mechanisms for advisory versus primary, advisory versus joint, is something that impacts and steers us away from the idea of parity between the two different decisional bodies. So, I generally or wholeheartedly agree with both what Mary said and Kathleen in terms of it has some level of importance, but what the most important element is getting to a level of parity that gives comfort, some level of comfort to market participants that their voice is being heard.
I'm not sure who's in charge of speaker audio bridge. Great, I appreciate that. And it's amazing. We've gotten to 40 minutes with only one audio problem, so that's pretty awesome. All right, Rob, it looks like you have a question for the panelists.
Yes, I wanted to go back to something that Mary said earlier, and that was around sort of how the exceptions would be sort of processed. And Mary, you talked about sort of a jurisdictional scope approach. And I was hoping you could just walk through that a little bit more and describe that to us a little bit.
All right, Mary, I see you muted.
Mary, please make sure your line is unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, I had unmuted myself before and then I think I got muted, so sorry about that. So I think the concept, and again, we are proposing this as something to talk about and consider. So I don't want to give the impression that it is sort of fully fleshed out, but I think the concept is to look at the types of rules that are under the authority of Board of Governors and comparable rules that are under the authority, or how those decisions gets made in the context of an EDAM entity. So, like an example, sorry, I was running up the stairs and lost my breath. The example is, for example, ancillary services. There's a type of ancillary service that is part of the day-ahead market, but it's not part of EDAM. And that type of ancillary service is, in the EDAM entity sphere, wouldn't be under the jurisdiction of joint authority or the Board of Governors. And so it also wouldn't be under the authority of come under joint authority in the context of the Kaiso BAA either. So I don't know if that was the best example, but it's sort of looking at parity across the types of rules. EDAM entities are making their own decisions through their tariffs about what type of ancillary services to provide in their BAAs. And similarly, the Kaiso BAA is making decisions through its market about the types of ancillary services and how to manage that. So in that context, you would say, okay, the EDAM entities are making decisions on this particular topic under their own tariffs, under their own jurisdiction. And similarly, the Kaiso BAA is making decisions on this type of topic under, its own jurisdiction, under its own decision-making process. But I would push a little bit on Scott's example of convergence bidding, because that would be an example, I think, where, even if those rules in, the first year of EDAM only apply in the Kaiso BAA, there's a requirement in the current proposal that convergence bidding would be a requirement for EDAM entities, in 1 or 2 years. So, and those rules would be embodied in the Kaiso tariff and not in EDAM entity tariffs. So I think that's an example actually that I think would rightly fall under joint authority, given the type of rule and how that type of rule would be implemented across the entire market footprint. So I hope that was clear enough example. It's kind of looking at it a little differently.
That was helpful. Thanks, Mary.
That. And Scott, would you like to respond?
Sure. Directly to Mary's comment, I understand the point that you're making, Mary, but it also, in my mind, is an option. And it is an option that potentially never comes to fruition. So there's a hesitation on my part to say it applies to until there's a reason for it to apply to. And with that option, that may never come to fruition. And that's where I think, in my mind, that continuous evolving of the apply to test allows for the window of opportunity to say, when someone is considering that option and is going to take it up, it should join the pool of items that come under the joint authority structure, and that in my head makes sense to me. Similar to how we are discussing how will the overall evaluation of the joint authority for EDAM come about. I believe there should be a discussion about how and when that comes to fruition once we get through market design rules about how that comes into effect. I will note for folks, there was comments around the role that an advisory decision or an advisory element makes. I'd like to share a little bit of my perspective on that. An advisory comment decision answer is materially different, in my mind, as a Kaiso LSE than a general stakeholder discussion. There is a lot of opinion, disagreement, and agreement, all healthy and productive inside the stakeholder process. It is my opinion that once you get to an advisory element for the governing body, that is not anybody and everybody's comment. That, to me, means the advice of expertise for entities that we are engaged with, wanting to work with, wanting to move forward with, and have a shared community and goal of moving that forward. That opinion takes on a very different level of importance to me in comparison to activities in the stakeholder process. I don't want that to sound like I'm devaluing the stakeholder processes. I believe they are also important. They have a different objective in my mind. And once you get to an advisory decision, in my opinion, it changes the value of and context for that answer and that input. And it needs to carry a much more substantial level of weight than what would generally come out of the stakeholder process. Again, they're trying to achieve two different things. I'm not trying to devalue the stakeholder process, but I take it in a much different light. So just wanted to share that for folks.
Thank you.
Thank you
I appreciate that. I see Kathleen has her hand up, and Mary, we're coming up towards, I think I have a little more time. So after Kathleen, we'll come to Mary. And if we can keep it tight, that would be great, although this dialogue is really what we're looking for, so I appreciate it. And colleagues, I'm going to ask you one more time if you want to raise hands. If I don't see any hands, I'm going to go to public comment. So commenters out there in the attendees list, be thinking about whether you want to raise your hand. So Kathleen, and then Mary, and then colleagues, I'll go to you again.
Great, thank you, and I'll be brief because this discussion has kind of highlighted for me that we agree with the way Mary is framing this as a jurisdiction kind of concept, but the way that we've been thinking about it is materially different. So I wanted to try and highlight that difference. Is rather than identifying items that are within scope, we have been thinking about this as each tariff section has a purpose, and each tariff section should have an initial default designation. And to some extent, the context for this comes from, there is a tariff ownership mapping that exists for internal owners. So kind of from, if I'm a policy lead at the Kaiso and I want to know whose, approvals are needed, I will look at the tariff section that is impacted by this policy. I will see the business unit owner, the department that owns that. That is who I need to vet it through. A similar process, building off of what already exists, could be done. This document exists that maps everything to flag tariff sections that are under joint authority or not as a default, and then could be evaluated further. And I think the convergence bidding is a great example of why we're focused on the tariff sections and not a concept. For example, Section 7 of the tariff is system operations under normal and emergency conditions. This includes a great deal of content. We believe this should be a joint authority default designation. There is a subsection in this part of the tariff that has to do with suspending or limiting convergence bidding. There's a couple different triggers that the Kaiso can have the flexibility to turn it off the functionality to submit it. If you make those kinds of changes, it impacts the entire market. And that impacts anyone participating in an EDM footprint. If you were to apply the concept of convergence bidding and say that's outside of scope, then changes to convergence bidding, like this section that might be impacted or changed, different triggers that could allow limiting convergence bidding or not, wouldn't be under joint authority. But if we start as a default that this, system operations under normal and emergency conditions is joint authority as a default, then we can have a discussion about whether or not this really should be considered joint authority or not. But we start with the basis. And there's a lot of examples of kind of how this, there's a lot of examples of gray where discussion is needed, little subsections that don't seem like they apply, that are nested within. But starting with the mapping gives us a place to start. And I just wanted to kind of highlight, we're thinking about it from the tariff control perspective versus a broad concept perspective.
Thank you. That's really helpful delineation. Mary.
Thank you. I just want to try to quickly respond a little bit to what Scott said. And, you know, I think that, and emphasize something that I said in my initial comments. You know, there's an appendix to the GRC proposal that evaluates sort of the legal framework of Kaiso's jurisdiction and concludes that, you know, the Board of Governors decision-making is supposed to take a diversity of interests in mind and is not supposed to put California's interests first. And I think that the governing body similarly is intended to consider all of the entities in the market, all of the entities that are affected. And I think if we really believe that, then the risk associated with under-inclusion is greater than the risk associated with over-inclusion. We trust these bodies to make decisions that weigh the interests and consider the interests. And so really kind of like parsing in great detail over, well, this might apply now, might apply next year, it's voluntary, all that kind of stuff. It's like there should be a rebuttable presumption that it's joint authority first, and that if there's gray area, that's the direction we should go versus really trying to like separate out which body is you know, sort of technically has jurisdiction over this or that. So I think it's important with respect to sort of the orientation with which we are, you know, sort of evaluating this question. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Eric, you have a question for the panelists, and let's do this as quick as we can so we can bring in other participants.
Thanks, Letha. Thanks, Letha. I think I've got two comments / questions. First, I want to be careful how we use the word jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is held by FERC, and we need to be really, really careful how we use that word, and for all of us, for all the stakeholders, and for the GRC. Second, on the exception process that we've heard about, I'm interested in hearing more, and I know we don't have much time today, but who will determine whether something, an initiative fits under the exception process? And that's something I'm interested in hearing about in the coming weeks. I don't know how that will work. I heard a couple of people say the apply to test is problematic. It's clunky. I get that. I think an exception process would also be a little clunky at times as to how you figure it out. So I just wanted to share those thoughts. Thanks, Letha.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate that. I see David Rubin, you would like to come in with a comment, and I'm going to ask attendees to raise their hands so that the operator can bring you in after David.
Thanks, Commissioner Tawney, and really appreciate the discussion that folks have been having. And I think it illustrates a number of issues. And again, I think for NV Energy, we're sort of unique amongst the EIM participants in that we have a statutory mandate to participate in an RTO by January of 2030. And thus we greatly appreciated the criteria in the straw proposal that the enhancements should support or advance a potential future governance structure appropriate for a multi-state RTO. And Obviously, when we look at the governing boards of all of the other FERC jurisdictional RTOs, they look like the members of the EIM governing body. They're not appointed by a governmental authority. And if we are, if EDAM, an objective of that market is to take an incremental step to RTO implementation, for us, a corresponding step for EDAM governance should be to give as much authority to the independent governing body in that joint authority context as we can. And we think that that should really apply to any and all issues related to the day ahead and real-time markets. You almost don't need to have an exception. What you need to do is learn to trust them as the governmental authority that we are going to get to if we're really going to get to a Western RTO. What we're focusing on here a lot, and you got into that in the issues between Scott and Mary over convergence bidding. If we're really fighting over something that applies this hour or tomorrow, that's not where we should be. What we really should be is moving towards a set of, generally accepted principles of independence and learning to trust the folks who represent that in our markets. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Operator, can you give the instructions for participants? We got just a couple of minutes, so
sure.
Let you break in.
Sure. As a reminder, if you're using the computer audio, please feel free to place yourself in the comment queue by utilizing the raise hand feature located at the bottom of your screen. Move your cursor to make the toolbar appear if needed. If you're on the mobile device, tap your screen to display the toolbar and then press raise hand. You will be unmuted when it's your turn. A pop-up message will appear and you'll need to accept the unmute message to become unmuted. If you're on the phone only, please make sure you press #2 to enter the comment queue. I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
All right. Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists for really delving into the topic. This is a lot of nuance and the perspectives you're bringing to the conversation are incredibly helpful to the GRC and reflect a lot of our own discussion, given that we're a stakeholder body. But the creative solutions and the different framing is very constructive and helpful for me as I think these issues through. I'm going to move to the next question and hand it over to my colleague, Amanda Ormond.
Thanks very much, Letha. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for, all the written comments that were submitted by participating today, and especially to our panelists who are willing to answer questions. Could we go to question number 2 on the slide, please? We're going to be talking about stakeholder engagement, and there were a couple issues that we asked for folks to give us comments on. They were enhancing stakeholder engagement and policy development, prioritizing, how do we prioritize and engage stakeholders in the road mapping process, and then some comments around how we're structuring the RIF and how we should look at the sectors there. So I've got 4 people that I think are going to comment, and I wanted to tell you the order that I'm going to call on you. So Chair LeVar, I'd like to go to you first. Kathleen, I'll come to you next. Josh, come to you third, and then Elaine, come to you fourth. So we'd love to hear your comments.
Thank you. I'll just give a couple of perspectives that I think underlie where the body of state regulators was coming from in our comments. I think our primary objectives that I think we have a consensus behind is elevating the voice of the RIF and also ensuring that there's transparency in the stakeholder process. And those 2 objectives guide the support that we had for the positions we took in our comments. As regulators in our dockets, we have to learn the difference between where comments are coming from, and stakeholder comments are more meaningful and more transparent when it's clear. And obviously, environmental advocacy groups are going to have different perspectives than consumer advocates who represent residential and small commercial consumers, and advocates who represent large industrial consumers. And they all need to be part of the big tent voice of stakeholder engagement. But I think the BOSR recognizes that there needs to be transparency, so the governing body and board of governors understands where the different perspectives are coming from. And so I appreciate that the GRC is taking a responsible path towards those objectives. And that's about all I have to add at this point. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. I think I said we'd go to Josh next.
Josh,
thank you. Sorry, I had a technical issue. Yeah, so maybe in terms of from my perspective, I think I'm maybe moving a little bit away from my role at City Light and maybe touching more on being a member of the RIF. One issue and item that that I think we need to maybe be more thoughtful, realistic, is that in the previous changes the GRC ultimately went through, and the augmentation to the RIF happened relatively, in the near past, if you will. So we're still in a place where we're trying to get our feet under us with the charge the RIF currently is asked to undertake. So I am supportive of the limited changes and the idea of including a roundtable, the idea of including augmentation to the roadmap process. I think those are relatively easy to integrate into the RIF. But above and beyond that, I think that the RIF as a body can continue to evolve with its current charge and still provide a high level of benefit to the deliberative process and to the EIM governing body and the Board of Governors for what is currently written into the bylaws today. So I think I'm supportive of the limited augmentation to the RIF. Significant or additional changes to the RIF may be a little bit of an element of happening either too soon or ultimately not needed because of the way that the RIF and the RIF bylaws are written today, where we're already able to provide a high level of impact or information to help in the process.
Okay, great. And I realize that I didn't read the question, so I'm going to go ahead and read the question in case there's anybody on the phone that's not on the web. So the question that we've asked panelists to respond to is, what material changes or ideas from comments around stakeholder engagement do you want the GRC to consider in its evaluation of comments and options? So that's what we're responding to on this panel. So can we go to Kathleen, please?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. And I appreciate the other thoughts. And Josh, your thoughts as well. Thank you so much, Rose. Josh and I are both on the liaison committee. So I'll give the same caveat that I'm one of the two RIF, IPP, and marketer sector liaisons. So I'm not just bringing my visitor hat. I definitely am bringing that perspective from being on the liaison committee when we were answering these questions. And the additional context that we'd like to share with the GRC is that your recommendations in the straw in and of themselves seem fair, okay? I think there are tweaks to whether or not, the existing charter and operating guidelines for the RIF definitely enable the RIF to do for on the roundtable piece, we already have that authority. What I think, so I wanted to try and highlight what we don't have, what I think is missing. So what's missing in the stakeholder engagement, or I shouldn't say missing, but maybe I should. The RIF is an auxiliary element to the existing stakeholder process. It is not integrated into the stakeholder process. And I think that the core of what challenges us and what we think through very frequently is, should it be? Is the RIF, first of all, I answer the question, what is the RIF often? When we're asking folks to participate in RIF meetings, I get the question, what is the RIF? So we're still doing a lot of education on what is the RIF. Part of the reason that I think the RIF is maybe not as widely understood, the Regional Issues Forum is not widely understood, is because it is this auxiliary element. It functions outside of the stakeholder process, and it's not clear what its role is unless you're really into the weeds like those of us who participate in it are. But that's not that. I think that just creates an appearance of creating a forum for stakeholders to have conversations, as opposed to really creating an impactful way for the broader. And how I would think of the RIF is it's all of the stakeholders. It's everyone that is impacted by the EIM, or if we expand to EDAM, by EDAM. So we believe that for the RIF, for the concept of trying to have as inclusive of a stakeholder process as possible, and if we want to utilize the RIF in a meaningful way, that both the Regional Issues Forum, and what is unique about it is that it created this idea of sectors. There are individual sectors that are supposed to be representing different cross sections of the stakeholder community, so there is an opportunity to have an inclusive discussion. I would view that as a sector experiment in these markets. We're experimenting with what are sectors, what are the right sectors, how do sectors coordinate, how do we summarize and communicate sector views up to the leadership. I think we're definitely still in an experimental phase, and we're working through trying to figure out how to productively follow through on that, including from a liaison perspective. How do we summarize our sector's views and share them with decision makers is something that we continually try to improve and think through. So to be transparent, we're learning by doing still. What I think would add value is if the sector concept is incorporated into the existing stakeholder process. This idea of RIF is one thing and stakeholder processes are something separate kind of ignores the fact that we're largely the same folks. So why, if we're going to pursue a sector approach, let's incorporate it a little bit better so that there is this sector concept across the board. The other thing that we think would be really helpful is for something similar to what the Market Surveillance Committee does, although I will caveat that we are not suggesting formal opinions. The value of the RIF in our mind is an opportunity for a broader discussion from a broader cross-section of stakeholders than you might have in a very detailed technical stakeholder meeting. With that in mind, we believe that as a part of the policy stakeholder process, staff should bring a brief on their proposals to the RIF at RIF and present on what the Kaiso is proposing to change, and elicit feedback from the RIF. That would give staff an opportunity to hear perspectives that they might not otherwise hear in the policy meetings at a RIF meeting. And there's value, if we believe there's value to that voice, then there's value in staff bringing these proposals to the RIF and receiving feedback on it. I don't necessarily think there needs to be formal opinions, written opinions, because the process is the value is the discussion, right? The feedback, the ability to talk together and to coordinate and collaborate. I would just one last thought on the working groups. Your proposal to have the policy roadmap process, I see as one example of staff doing that. I just don't think we need to be so prescriptive that it's only the policy process that would have value from RIF feedback. So I hope that's a little clearer. Was our thing. We absolutely see that your proposal is what we'd like to see in concept for one issue, that we think it should probably be adopted for broader issues, those under joint authority, for example. On the working groups, we are concerned about the extensive amount of time that working groups require, and that that creates some barriers to entry for certain stakeholders that don't have as much staff, stakeholders that don't have as many resources. We just think it's really critical that if we're going to take a stance that working groups are needed, we should do this in a rational way. And kind of ask ourselves the question, what items would benefit from a working group process and why? And so we encourage the GRC to take a little bit more take a step back and think through the working group item in more detail, because we wouldn't want to see a negative outcome where it's just really creating a format for some stakeholders to be able to be involved and other stakeholders that we want to include on the concept. Back to the RIF, like, what are we trying to do is pull in a broad cross-section of stakeholders. Perhaps one idea is, how can the RIF be involved? And another comment on existing charters of the operating guideline of the RIF is that as the Regional Issues Forum, we're supposed to be bringing together sub-teams of stakeholders, cross-section of stakeholders, to work on issues that are important to the broader EIM. And under an EDAM, let's say now we're talking broader day-ahead and real-time market operations. The RIF could be utilized when staff says, hey, we think it would be beneficial to have a working group. We could utilize the RIF to bring stakeholders together into those sub-teams in order to work on these issues as a working group, and then bring them back and work through them with staff and the RIF. And we wanted to put that forward as maybe a way to leverage an existing framework that transparently, I don't believe we've done this yet in the RIF, but it is a authority and a concept that we should be doing. So perhaps there's a way to integrate the concept into the existing RIF framework.
Thank you. I want to ask a follow-up question just to make sure, to get some clarity. So you had said bring the sector process into the stakeholder process, and I'm wondering at what level. And so if you did that, would it limit participation, because then you might have sector representatives, or just how would that work?
Yeah, no, thanks, Amanda. I view the sectors as expanding representation rather than limiting representation. The sectors is a way to put some rational concept around groups within the stakeholder process. For, I guess, a detailed kind of suggestion, we think that all stakeholders should register what sector they're in, identify their sectors. In the commenting tool, you can see the market participant or the stakeholder who's commenting and your organization. Similarly, it would be a very simple enhancement just to add the sector category for that stakeholder. So in the stakeholder process, staff could see not only the market participant's name, its organization, but also what sector it's within. That can provide some context for staff when it's getting information from, let's say, briefings out from the sector liaisons, which is separate from, I'm a member of this sector. And as a member of a sector, I would have no problem saying I'm a member of the IPP and marketer sector and having that on my comment. The other thing that I think could be a way to bring the sector concept into the stakeholder process, taking it up a level from the individual member to whether it's at a RIF where all individual members can attend and are encouraged to, and as well as a liaison, is that staff should endeavor to try, a way to incorporate is that you should endeavor to try to understand the perspective of a sector. Does that, and I think one way to do that is to have them come to RIF and present their policy proposals and receive feedback from the broader RIF, which again, I think is as inclusive, and we try to be incredibly inclusive to all stakeholders. Encourage everyone to attend and ask questions and participate in it. The liaisons themselves can brief up, but we're really supposed to be briefing the governing body, Kaiso leadership, board of governors, like that level. The RIF itself I would envision it's actually the members of the RIF attending that meeting, providing the feedback to staff as the primary value at the staff level.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate that. So let's go to Elaine, please.
Hi, so can you hear me? I think I've unmuted and undone everything.
Yeah.
Hi, okay.
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Elaine Ginocchio. I am a markets policy consultant and an attorney. I primarily spend my time working for Western Resource Advocates. I took pen to paper on creating and working with a group of organizations for putting together the consensus comments on the straw proposal. And those comments represented 4 public interest organizations and a large clean energy buyer organization. So to the extent that I can, I'm hoping my comments are consistent with the written comments, these consensus comments. But if they aren't for some reason, they should be, those are my own opinions. I'm not bringing any new information or any new opinions from the group. So I just wanted to make that clear before I started talking. I'd like to start by commending the GRC, as somebody else did, on their commitment to this process and the quality of their work. If I'm not mistaken, most of the members are original members and have been engaged in this review for probably over 2 years via 3 phases of work, and feel that they have put together a very thorough and thoughtful proposal for phase 3. We felt that this straw proposal was generally a strong start to a final set of governance recommendations that will support the extended day-ahead market. We also generally, we agreed with the vast majority of the recommendations in the proposal, with some caveats or maybe suggestions for improvements. And I just wanted to say that not all the ideas in this proposal were recommendations. Some were ideas on which the GRC is seeking further comments before they do make a recommendation, if any. And we tried to provide our opinion or information or helpful information on everything in the proposal. I'd also like to say that we feel like the straw proposal reflects a willingness by Kaiso and the stakeholders to evolve the governance structure of the market as new offerings of the market are developed. Feeling that adaptability is a really important characteristic for well-functioning market governance, and this is evidence of that adaptability. And then finally, I'd like to say we really appreciate the GRC opportunity, providing opportunities like today, a meeting where stakeholders can share their feedback and their questions and their concerns in a discussional forum. I personally feel like this is really helpful to hear perspectives of other organizations and be able to discuss ours with others. And I don't think I'm unique in that feeling. So we agreed strongly with the 3 aspects of this section of the proposal. And the first that I'm going to talk about is the Kaiso's current stakeholder engagement model, which the recommendation was to remain with this current stakeholder engagement model. It's described as having a 2-dimensional framework. They showed it on a graph with 2 axes. So the 2 dimensions of it were that the engagement process is open equally to all, rather than providing superior opportunities to some market participants or a subset of stakeholders. The other dimension was that decisions are made by an independent body, like the board and the governing body, as opposed to providing decision-making authority or at least greater influence to some market participants or a subset of stakeholders. In our opinion, this is inclusive and provides equal access for all stakeholders, which we think is really important, and it's consistent with what we hold to be good governance principles. So we agree with that recommendation to stay with that model of stakeholder engagement. Then the 2 other recommendations, which were increasing the use of stakeholder working groups at the early stage of policy development. We also agree this is a good idea. It will provide more meaningful input for stakeholders. I'd also like to, consistent with one of the other speakers, was that deciding when to use this is important. This does provide, it will need additional staff resources, but also it will require stakeholders to devote more time and resources to this kind of a process. So it's a really good idea. It shows Kaiso being responsive to stakeholder concerns and ideas, because I think a lot of folks liked the working group concept, especially in the big complex initiatives like EDAM. And they said that. And so Kaiso then took that, and now we're talking about institutionalizing it. And this process itself, the way you go from an idea, stakeholders' concerns, into something actually happening, I think shows responsiveness of the market governance. But again, having a standard for when you apply that, because it's a good idea, but it's also going to require a lot of resources, and not just of staff, but of the stakeholders themselves. And the other idea that we support is the recommendation to create the roundtable discussion that would be hosted by the RIF. I think, as it was mentioned, the RIF has increased its scope of what it can discuss and review has increased. The specific aspects of what it could do are the same, but I think the RIF will probably get involved and do more things, because the scope of its discussions has increased to now allow discussions of stakeholder initiatives that are in the Kaiser stakeholder process. I feel like these two ideas, this idea of the RIF roundtable, will help them. It's a nice discrete step that helps the RIF, because I think what they're doing right now is figuring out, now that we have an expanded scope, how do we take on our role? And I think this provides a nice discrete step that allows them to move into this expanded scope that they have. And so we are very supportive of this. So that is, I liked a lot of what has been said about what the RIF's role is now. And I'm hoping that this encourages discussion from others about how the RIF will move forward.
Elaine, thanks so much. So I wanted to ask if any of the other panelists wanted to make a comment, or if any of the GRC members have additional questions for some of the panelists. Therese.
Thanks. I want to ask a very brief question. Kathleen, of the things that you mentioned, this is just a yes or no question. Do you think the options for expanding the RIF are within the current authority of the RIF?
I'm going to ask a clarifying question first. You mean what was proposed in the GRC straw?
No. Some of the things you talked about additional roles.
I think it's within the scope of the RIF. I don't think it's the RIF. I know you asked for a yes or no. Yes. I don't think it's the RIF. It's the corporate culture structure that needs to include incorporating the RIF.
Great. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Jeff?
Good morning. I'm not sure who this is addressed to, but it's more mechanics of RIF. Does the RIF ever do straw polls to see where stakeholders are, to sort of gauge, I don't know, just hand count or even sector count? And should they?
I mean, I can just speak briefly, Jeff. This is Kathleen for the IPP and marketer sector side. We haven't done that to date. We can. We have the option to, but we have not leveraged that.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Yeah, because something that I think Rob was saying, I think it was Rob, that it really is nice to understand not only what people's positions are, but what their perspective is, where that position is coming from. That's really helpful for the decision makers.
Thank you, Jeff. I don't see any other hand raised, so I want to see if the operator, if there's any other comments from participants.
I do not see any participants in the queue as of now. As a reminder, if you'd like to make a comment, please feel free to place yourself in the comment queue by utilizing the raise hand feature located at the bottom of your screen. Move your cursor to make the toolbar appear if needed. If you're on a mobile device, tap your screen to display the toolbar, then press raise hand. You will be unmuted when it's your turn. A pop-up message will appear and you will need to accept the unmute message to become unmuted. If you're on the phone only, please make sure you press #2 to enter the question queue. I do see one participant in the queue. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Hi, thanks. This is Meredith Aiken from PowerX. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Oh, great, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some comments, and just wanted to also echo that, we appreciate all the hard work that the GRC has done. And also wanted to say I appreciated the discussion in the previous question, including the framing of the issue that David Rubin provided at the end. Certainly some, complex details to work through, but, the EIM is quite small compared to the potential size of the EDAM. And so this really warrants that, in our view, the expanded scope to address, all the topics, especially as the market does evolve. So wanted to kind of address very specifically, kind of building on some of that. We wanted to focus our comments here on a specific suggestion that PowerX raised in our written comments to address something that we see as equally problematic and also difficult to solve, namely Kaiso's inherent conflicts of interest and the staff-led decision process. The Kaiso is the market operator, but is also an interested party. It's a participating balancing authority, a participating transmission provider, and even has acted as a procurement agent for load in California. As such, the Kaiso should not also be leading the decisions for a regional market. PowerX suggests establishing a sector-based executive committee with a workable voting structure to decide upon detailed proposals before they are brought forward to the EIM governing body and the Kaiso Board of Governors for approvals. To be clear, this is not the RIF Roundtable Forum or a working group. This is an executive committee empowered to drive the process and decisions. This concept draws upon the framework being implemented for the Western Resource Adequacy Program, as well as that's under discussion right now for the SPP Markets Plus. The RIF Roundtable would inform this committee, and the Kaiso could provide subject matter expertise to this executive committee without being the primary driver of the process or the decisions for the regional market. It's it's important to solve these governance problems at the highest level, but our view is it runs deeper than that alone, and therefore we must address it at the organizational level as well. And we appreciate all the hard work that's gone in to date on this very difficult topic, and that it's bounded by the existing legal constraints. However, we really think that this is an important step so that the governance framework can provide stakeholders throughout the West the confidence that the governance structure represents the market as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. I think we're ready to move on to the next question, unless, operator, there's anybody else that has a hand raised.
I do not see any other participants in the queue as of now.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Beck.
Thank you. Operator, could you turn to the next slide, please? Next, we're going to address a couple of the issues that received, I would say, relatively fewer comments, and hear from a couple of our panelists. But this is also going to be a relatively shorter segment. So I want to give all of the members of the audience a heads up that you may, if you have something to say on this, we'll be getting to you relatively quickly. So go ahead and raise your hand to get in the queue as soon as you would like to so indicate. So next we're going to talk about and ask what considerations would you like the GRC to have on issues related to the size and compensation for the Western EIM governing body and or the bylaws for the ISO Board of Governors. This covers a couple of the questions we asked you in the stakeholder comments. And I'm not giving Elaine much of a break. She was the last speaker on the last question, and I'd like her to go first on this question. And then after that, I will move to Chair LeVar. So Elaine, I hope that you took a gulp of water and are ready to go again. Please join us and give us your thoughts.
Thanks, no problem. Thank you for the introduction, Michelle. Beginning with expanding the size of the governing body. Again, this is not a recommendation by the GRC. They're seeking comments on whether the size of the governing body should be increased from 5 to 7 members. I think on the one hand, the benefit of this would have been additional members could enhance the collective expertise of the body and enable additional work or greater engagement in detail by forming committees. On the other side, there didn't seem to be evidence of the necessity of increasing the size of the governing body. Yes, perhaps benefits, but there's going to be a cost to that. And without having some evidence that there's a necessity, we weren't supportive of the idea at this time. And as an example, some of the costs in both time and money, the nomination process would increase. That would be work by the nominating committee. You have more seats to fill, and that would reach the end of their term and be refilled or when members leave. The salary expense of the additional members. And last but not least, in December of last year, as you all know, the governing body and board began meeting in joint sessions under the joint authority model. You now have 10 members of the combined bodies meeting together, reviewing and discussing potential changes to the Kaiser tariff. The time to allow for each member and governor to provide their perspective, to debate, and to vote is already quite substantial. An increase in members would increase that process as well. And again, without any evidence of the necessity. The other was the governing body compensation. Again, the GRC is seeking comments on whether to recommend that the board consider an increase of the governing body members' compensation. This was not a recommendation by the body. Again, it's expected. So we were are supportive of this. It's expected that EDM would be operational in 2024. The governing body's responsibilities will substantially increase if EDM is implemented because of the increase in the scope of their authority, as well as the volumes of transactions through that market. Further, by 2024, it will have been 6 years since the last compensation review, which took place in 2018. So even without considering EDM, we were supportive of having a review at least by 2024, just because, some examples of events that have taken place just in the last 4 years since 2018. You've had the August 2020 heat wave events, the expanded scope of rules under the governing body's authority by implementing joint authority, and then the increase in the WEIM participants from 6 entities to 13 now this year. So we agree that there should be a review of compensation. And I believe when I looked at the memo about the last compensation review, that when they did that review, the board and the body were, I think, below the 25th percentile, meaning when you look at other boards for similar organizations in terms of their salary and benefits. And after the 2018 increase, they were below the 50th percentile. So there's probably room here 6 years later to review that again. And the final issue in this was the suggested bylaw change that Kaiso has suggested in order to assuage some concerns that Kaiso might be under some statutory mandate to treat different participants in different ways or unfairly. So what I thought was really great about this was there was a legitimate concern. Kaiso put the time together to do a legal memo and fully explain the statutes that apply and how they affect their responsibilities. And the answer there was that under the current statutes, they are under the responsibility to treat all market interests. They are not under responsibility to treat any group unfairly or outside interests different than California interests. However, they didn't stop there, which I really commend. Instead of just saying, hi, everybody, here's a memo, here's the answer to your question, this should make you feel better. They said, well, let's make this clear and put it in a place where everybody can see it, have it crystal clear, and change the bylaws. So we're very supportive of this, and we commend them for doing that and hope that this is adopted. So that's the end of my comments. Thank you so much.
Elaine, thank you so much for the thoughtful coverage of those issues. And I'm going to turn quickly to Chair LeVar to hear his thoughts as well. Could you please go ahead, Thad?
Sure, thanks, Michelle. Just a couple things to add from the boss's perspective. Obviously, in our comments, we supported maintaining the governing body at 5 members. I just want to say one of the most meaningful things that we do as a body of state regulators, and which happens behind the scenes, it doesn't result in written comments or public positions, is evaluating candidates for the governing body. And I can just say, in my experience, the candidate pool has been outstanding, both those who are selected and those who are not selected. There has always, at least the ones I participated in, there has always been a good slate of people interested in participating in that role and wanting to contribute to the energy and balance market in that way. So the only other point that I just wanted to highlight from our comments is that evaluations of both qualification requirements and compensation ought to be proportional to the changes that are happening with a move towards a day-ahead market, and that move certainly warrants some look at those issues, but any change ought to be proportional. I don't know that we use the word proportional in our comments, but I think that concept underlie. I don't know if there's a right tense of underlie to use for that sentence. I got hooked up, but that concept was within our comments, and that's all I have to add. I'll finish with that verbal stumble.
Thank you, and we are all sympathetic. The stumble, believe me. Before I turn it over, we do want to leave plenty of time for the other ideas. Is there anyone else on the panel who has a thought they'd like to add to this? And then I'll ask our operator if we have anyone from the public who raised their hand. Not seeing anyone from the panel. Operator, do you have anyone from the public with a raised hand?
I do not see anyone in the queue from the participant side.
Okay, and I did neglect to ask if anyone from the GRC wanted to make a point or ask a question. So I'll wrap up with that. Do a quick scan. Jeff, are you raising your hand for this point?
Yes, I am. I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel is something that sort of, I understand the change in scope. I understand that. There's also sort of a fiduciary duty / accountability dimension to this. And I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has thought through that aspect of it on, just to put it bluntly, where does the buck ultimately stop in decisions? Who's ultimately accountable? And what's the difference between the governing body and the ISO's board when it comes to ultimate accountability? I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts on that.
Well, let me see if we can get any hands raised on that. So, David, please go ahead.
Sure. I'll take a shot at it. And, you know, I might as well at least try and be consistent with what I said earlier. The thought being that, again, if we're under a joint authority model and we really should be transitioning more towards that look at what independent governance would be under an RTO, they really, you know, obviously, you know, the state law and the ultimate responsibility is going to be with the Board of Governors. But in terms of, I think, what we've been discussing here, as far as compensation, I think, in our view, the governing body should be commensurate with the board, because that responsibility really should apply to any and all participants, those within the California ISO footprint and those on the outside. And so you're looking towards that. You should be treating them similarly with regard to compensation, and that compensation should also look obviously at the Western Power Pools Board and a potential Market Plus independent panel, just to make sure you're attracting that top talent that we've all seen on the governing body thus far. So that would be my immediate reaction to Jeff's question is we really don't want to try and layer in those kinds of distinctions. You know, obviously, though, there's that recognition of where authority is under the current California law.
Appreciate that response very much, David. And I don't want to give the question short change here, but we do want to have enough time for the last question. So if everyone will allow me, I'm going to turn the time over to Rob Taylor now to take that last question on.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. And good morning, everybody. And I want to thank everybody for hanging in with us here as we get to the last question. So I'm going to follow the same process everyone else has followed. We're going to start with the panelists. Then I'll ask the GRC, my fellow GRC members, if they have any questions, and then we'll open it up to all participants. And as you can see from the question, we're a bit of a catch-all here. So I'd ask you, from your perspective, are there other aspects of governance or other ideas that have been offered by other stakeholders that you think are important for us as the GRC to consider or to explore as we start to move towards our final phase here? I'm going to start this one off with Chair LeVar. If you could go ahead and give us your thoughts on this, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks. Well, I think I'll just make one point that I actually made before, but it's worth repeating, that assuming the GRC's proposal to amend the bylaws with respect to the interests that should be considered, I hope that kind of a change can be meaningful. As a state regulator, I look to our statutes and administrative rules as our starting point for everything. And I hope that if this bylaw change goes through, we will see the way that that both bodies address issues reflect that more prominently. Not that there's any criticism of anything in the past, but I hope we see concrete results out of that change in the bylaws, because it should be meaningful and it should be significant. That's all I have to add right now. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I know I didn't give you any warning here, but Mary, if you have some thoughts here, I'd appreciate it. And then next I'll go to Kathleen.
Sure, thanks. Just Rob, just a couple of short comments here. First of all, I think very much agree with what Commissioner LeVar was just saying about the change in the bylaws. I think it is a minor yet hopefully significant clarification and important for entities outside of California who continue to be concerned about some of the how decision making is balanced. The other thing that I wanted to mention was just with respect to the whether or not joint authority is going to be applied to the EDAM proposal, and just emphasize that it's appropriate for joint authority to for the EDAM proposal to be under joint authority, and that to consider the timing with respect to how that gets approved to just ensure that happens. I don't think PGP has a particular perspective on ensuring that happens, but just wanted to make sure that we have that in place. That's all I have.
Great, thanks, Mary. Kathleen.
Great, thanks, Rob. I'd like to leave the GRC with a broad thought or suggestion. In order for any of the individual proposals to be effective, I think what is needed is a recognition that there needs to be a culture shift within the Kaiso organization itself. And I'll say organization, tariff, etc., governance. It's the whole system that needs to shift the culture to a more inclusive approach to all market participants. I did have a reaction to the bylaw proposal when I first read it, which jumped out at me as a symptom of the need for this culture shift. There's not a Kaiso BAA and an EIM BAA. Kaiso is an EIM BAA. It is one of the EIM BAAs. To think of Kaiso and EIM as separate is both not accurate physically, not from a market model perspective, nor from an operations perspective, and it creates challenges. There are differences in implementation because of the different types of operations in a day-ahead process, but we're all within the EIM. EIM is the real-time market footprint. If we move to an EDAM, Kaiso and non-Kaiso BAAs are all going to be EDAM BAAs. We need to start thinking broadly as a community of all of the BAAs within the market footprint that we're setting up as a part of that market, and not create this false distinction between the Kaiso and non-Kaiso BAAs within EIM or EDAM. With all the caveats that we agreed that there's things that are very clearly out of scope, right? RMR, RA, transmission planning, that's all an RTO function. But from a day-ahead market coordination perspective, from a real-time market coordination perspective, we're all BAs are in this together. We think that culture shift needs to clearly happen and recognize that. The other culture shift that we think needs to happen is that on the stakeholder process, it does appear inclusive, but in practice, it's not that inclusive. There is an asymmetrical access to decision makers, to different stakeholders who can access, whether it's a governing body, board of governor member, whether it's the executive leadership of the Kaiso versus staff. There's not a clear way for stakeholders to gain access on an equal basis. And so there's an asymmetrical access to some stakeholders and not to others. I think it's appropriate to recognize that. And if we want an inclusive and equal access for stakeholders, we should be thinking about how to do that. Maybe there's someone on Kaiso's staff that's available for any stakeholder to contact and ask for their help in facilitating a meeting. Any stakeholder. That would be one way to try to make it a little bit more inclusive. But today, I don't think it's very inclusive for all stakeholders. And we should recognize that and try and think about ways to cure that as we move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Appreciate those comments. And Scott, I believe you had some thoughts that you wanted to share on this question as well.
Sure. Sorry. Struggling to get off mute. I apologize. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just well.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. There's been a robust discussion today, and I certainly appreciated the governance issues that exist today, have existed in the past, are challenging. There's no argument about that. I think one of the things that I think would help the overall process is the path forward has steps to it that need to be clearly defined. The advancement of joint authority with EIM was a positive step. We are now talking about EDAM. A lot of the comments that are made here today really envision a world in the future that I don't disagree with a lot of the comments, but it also is a world in the future. And part of PG&E's focus in this process is on there is an element that needs to happen today. Whether you lean further into what will happen in the future or back off from that, I'm not opining on either side. But there is an urgent element that needs to be addressed today and needs to derive an answer. That does not necessarily indicate that future or what that future ultimately looks like. And I think it would be helpful for the GRC to help, and I know this has been asked for by others, to draw a map for that. How did those steps come to fruition? How do we think about, and maybe that's a more broad discussion about what is the path towards that future? How and when do we need to make those steps, as opposed to deciding at each increment, what is the amount of step we're willing to make at this particular juncture? And what does that also mean to the future? That continues to push the issue of what will happen in the future? What will governance look like in the future? And there's no argument for me. If we're going to eventually move to an RTO, the governance needs to expand significantly, materially. How do we draw a line for people to see when the GRC is thinking about those steps and those actions taking place so that it ultimately gets there? And then we could debate where along those lines those things should happen. But the step function seems to be a challenge to the overall breadth of the conversation. And then it ends up in a struggle to define an answer for the urgent, critical item at this point in time. let me leave you with that. But thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Great. Thanks, Scott. I appreciate those comments. Any other comments from other panelists that you'd like to speak to this question? If not, let me ask the other GRC members if you have any questions of the panelists or any clarifying questions you want to ask. I see Therese has her hand up.
Thanks. This is a question for Scott. You kind of mentioned this idea of a roadmap, which we got comments about that from the beginning. And the thing that we kind of ran into as a GRC is that, you know, what's not in our scope is not in our scope, right? And so to build a roadmap for the future is not in our scope, but we're, you know, kind of cognizant of that future. What would be helpful from your perspective for the GRC? Is it to there are a lot of ideas, and there's a lot of conversation here today about establishing for the future. I'm trying to see if there's some way you can help us with what work would be helpful for what's before us versus those things that are not before us.
Therese, I understand that it is not inside the GRC scope, but it's clearly a context for the discussion. So is utilization of the GRC forum or the RIF forum a better mechanism to be able to say, what would it need to evolve into? And not necessarily as a decision, but it allows people to come to, you know, and to be clear, I know portions of this work have been done. What are some of the legislative changes that need to happen in California if we get to an RTO? How do we package that as a set of information and focus the discussion on discrete elements of it at particular points in time? But it also sets for people a roadmap that says, how can we get to the future? Western regionalization has been talked about probably since from before I was born. It continues to be a challenging topic. There's a lot of momentum for it now for various different reasons. How do we compartmentalize and open that discussion to resolving what is urgent and present, as opposed to generically speaking about what the future will portend if we don't know that that future is reality? I think there's a lot of desire and hope, but I don't know that it's reality.
Thanks.
Any other GRC members? If not, are there any other participants that have a comment or question of the panelists?
As a reminder, you can click on the raise hand icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you're using the computer audio, if you're on the phone only, please make sure you press #2 on your telephone keypad.
Okay,
I do not see any participants.
Okay, thank you, operator. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Therese. Again, thanks to the panelists for your participation today. I think a lot of very insightful comments that'll help us out.
Great. Thanks, Rob, and thanks to the other GRC members, Michelle and Letha and Amanda, for moderating those questions, and to all the panelists and others that participated. If we can go to the next slide, let's just talk about some next steps for the GRC. First of all, I want to reiterate again what I said at the beginning. Your comments are super helpful to us. Something we did differently this time, we posted the questions that we were going to talk about in advance, because we're not just looking to hear from panelists. We really do want to hear from all of you. So feel free to opine on those. And again, if you didn't raise your hand today and you want to talk to a GRC member, always feel free to do that. So here we are on August 29th. We are going to work, the GRC members are going to work through September to refine the proposal based on all of your input. And the goal is to have a revised proposal issued by late October, with also a plan to have a final proposal by December. Just a reminder, although we did receive comment on this, so what I'm about to say is our current strategy. We did receive comment that we will consider from all of you, but the plan is to bring the governance proposal to the Board of Governors and the ISO board, or the Board of Governors and the governing body at the same time that the EDAM market design proposal goes forward. I want to recognize there were some commenters that suggest we should put the governance proposal first to have the assurance that the EDAM market design proposal is under joint authority. We will work through those comments and give response to that in the revised proposal that's coming in late October. That's all we have on the Governance Review Committee today, but I'm going to turn it over to Milos to talk about what's coming next. So I think if we go to the next slide. Oh, that's our helpful links. One more slide. Is there one more slide on this? There we go. Okay, Milos. Are you there? No. Oh,
I do not see.
Connecting. I see he's connecting. I see Milos. I know he wants to talk to us. For some reason.
Yes, he's connecting, but he has to connect to the audio. Looks like he has joined the webinar, but has to connect to the audio.
Well, I'll pinch hit for a little bit here. What you can see on the screen is the.
Okay, can you hear me okay now?
There we go.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yep, we got you.
All right. Good morning, and I apologize for the connection issues. I just wanted to, again, extend our invitation to both the GRC members as well as the stakeholders listening on this call to the EDAM meeting that we have next at 10 a.m. here in just a couple of minutes on the EDAM revised straw proposal. It's a virtual meeting where we're going to walk through the components of the revised straw proposal. And then as well, towards the end of that meeting, we've also announced this, but on September 7th and the 8th, we're going to have an in-person as well as a virtual meeting. As well, we're going to continue talking through elements of the proposal and leverage some of the stakeholder panels, similar to what we did on the straw proposal, to react and share their perspectives on a number of the different design elements. So this is just to extend an invitation to all of you to join us here shortly for the discussion on the proposal.
Great. Thank you, Milos. Thanks, everybody, for participating. Looks like you have 2 minutes and transition to the next meeting. We appreciate all your involvement and participation, and look forward to talking to you as we go through the next steps. With that, our meeting is adjourned.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.